The night my father raised his glass and called my work quaint, I was sitting at the wrong end of the room, literally. Table 11. Nearest the catering exit. No floral arrangement, just a tea light in a glass jar and a card with my name printed in plain font. I'd known about the seating assignment for 2 weeks. What I hadn't known was what would happen when the man beside me, the man my family had never once bothered to ask about. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The Cole family has been designing buildings since 1961. My grandfather drafted his first blueprint on a drafting table in a Raleigh walk-up with a T-square and borrowed ambition. My father expanded that into Cole & Associates, 14 architects, a glass-walled studio on the 14th floor downtown, and a reputation that got you invited to the right dinners. The office lobby has a gallery wall. Grandfather in his early career headshot, hard hat tilted back. My father at the ribbon cutting for the Meridian Civic Center. My sister Brooke at her graduate school pinning ceremony, flanked by both parents, all three of them beaming. I'm not on that wall. Not because I failed to accomplish something. Because at 20, when I told my family I wanted to study physical therapy instead of architecture, the air went out of the room in a way that never quite came back. My mother's response was precise. "Warren," she said to my father, setting down her fork, "what will we say to the Lunds?" The Lunds were family friends. Architects, naturally. My father didn't answer that night. He just started calling my career Marin's Detour. And the name stuck until it became the family's preferred way of explaining me away. 8 years is a long time to be someone's detour. I work as a licensed physical therapist at a regional rehabilitation center. $61,000 a year. I help stroke patients relearn how to lift a coffee cup. I work with veterans who lost limbs and need to renegotiate every ordinary motion. I watch people decide, sometimes daily, whether the effort of continuing is worth it, and I try to make sure they choose yes. My parents call it hands-on work with a pause before hands-on that carries more freight than any insult they've ever spoken aloud. The moment I stopped waiting for them to change came about 9 months ago. Our rehabilitation center was named Program of the Year by the State Physical Therapy Association, a recognition given once annually to a single facility. I had led the grant application. I had coordinated the care model they cited. I sent the ceremony invitation to the family group text 3 weeks in advance. My father replied the next morning, "Marin, I have a site walkthrough that evening. You understand how these things are." The day after the ceremony, he was photographed at the opening gala for a civic plaza Brooke had contributed design work to. I saw it on social media. Him in his blazer, arm around her, the kind of smile he only produces when he's genuinely proud. I kept my award letter on my kitchen counter for a month. After a while I stopped seeing it and just saw a piece of paper, and that was somehow worse. So when people ask why I never told my family much about Callum, why I kept him separate from that world, the simplest answer is they never asked. They knew I was seeing someone. My mother's complete interrogation, delivered by phone in September, was, "Is he in your field?" No. Does he have a career path? He runs his family's orchard. A pause. Well, I suppose that's sustainable enough for now. That was it. 18 months of my life summarized in 2 sentences and a shrug. Callum Reed runs 400 acres of apple and pear orchards in the hill country 2 hours west of the city. 3rd generation. He wakes at 5, knows every tree by its yield history, and can tell you which block needs drainage work and which one just needs patience. He drives a rusted Chevy with a cracked dashboard and keeps a spare pair of work boots in the bed. When I first met him at a regional farmer's market, I'd stopped for cider and stayed 40 minutes. He asked me what I loved about my work. Not what it paid. Not whether it was secure. What I loved. I told him about a patient that week, a 68-year-old man relearning to write his name after a stroke. How on Thursday he'd signed a birthday card for his granddaughter, with his own hand for the first time in 8 months. Callum listened like that story was the most important thing he'd heard all week. He was not, however, exactly what he appeared. There were small inconsistencies. A phone call he stepped away to take, speaking in the tone of someone who runs meetings. A legal brief on his kitchen counter, dense, annotated in his handwriting. A line in his email, glimpsed accidentally. Read Land Conservancy. Board resolution required before close of quarter. I asked about it once. He said, old project, nothing interesting. I let it go. Not because I wasn't curious, but because it didn't change anything that mattered. He saw me clearly. That was rarer than any title. Brooke's engagement party was held at the Aldrich House, a restored estate on the east side with a camellia garden, and enough square footage to fit 60 guests without crowding. My parents had booked it months in advance. String quartet, tiered champagne display, catering staff in white jackets. Brooke was marrying Sebastian Hargrove, a civil engineer with a gentle manner, and a father, former Ambassador Douglas Hargrove, who was the evening's most prestigious guest. Callum and I arrived on time. He wore a charcoal jacket over a dark shirt. I wore a plain burgundy dress, my own choice, not the powder blue thing my mother had messengered to my apartment with a note suggesting it was more appropriate for the occasion. My parents greeted us at the entrance. My mother's smile tightened fractionally when she saw the dress. My father gave Callum one nod, the kind you give a valet. I'd found out about the seating 10 days before. I had stopped by my parents' house to return something, and heard my mother on the phone in the kitchen, door half open, voice crisp, the Cole girl and her guest at table 11, near the service corridor. Plain cards are fine. They won't need to be part of the formal introduction sequence. I stood in the hallway for a full minute before I moved again. Not because I was shocked. Because I'd spent 8 years making excuses for smaller versions of exactly this, and hearing it stated that plainly out loud in her most efficient register, they won't need to be part of the formal introduction sequence, removed the last soft tissue of ambiguity. I told Callum about it that night. Do you want to skip it? He asked. I thought about it seriously. No, I said finally. I need to go. Not to prove anything. I just need to see it clearly, one last time, and then I'm done. He was quiet for a moment. Then I'll be there. Table 11 was exactly as described. Far corner, near the corridor that led to the catering station. The centerpiece was a single candle. The name cards were printed in a standard font. Tables 1 through 6 had hand-lettered cards with a sprig of dried lavender tucked beneath each one. Former Ambassador Hargrove sat at table 1 beside my parents, relaxed and warm, his silver hair catching the chandelier light. He glanced across the room twice in the first 10 minutes. Both times his gaze settled briefly on Callum before moving on. The third time he stopped moving. I watched the recognition work its way across his face, first a furrow, then a stillness, then something close to disbelief. The room quieted for my father's toast. He stood at the head table, glass raised, and did what he had always done well, command attention by making people feel the weight of being allowed to listen to him. He spoke warmly about legacy, about what it meant to build something lasting, about Brooke, whom he praised with the specific detailed pride of someone who had been paying attention for 30 years. She has never once taken the easy path, he said, and the room murmured its appreciation. Then his eyes moved to me with the calibrated care of someone executing a plan. My younger daughter Marin, he said, in a tone that managed to be indulgent and dismissive in a single register, chose a different direction. Physical therapy. Hands-on work. I'm sure it's deeply rewarding. He let the sentence end there, hanging. And she's brought along her partner, who tends an orchard, if I have it right. A few polite chuckles. He looked directly at me. Still happy out there among the apple trees? The smile beneath it was immaculate. 60 people turned in my direction. I did not answer. I cut a piece of food and put it in my mouth. Callum set down his fork and stood. The room registered it as a physical event, the way a room registers a door opening. Ambassador Hargrove rose at the same moment, as though pulled by the same current. He crossed the floor from table 1 and the whole room watched him do it, watched the most decorated guest at the party walk toward table 11, with an expression that made my father's smile slip for the first time all evening. Callum, the ambassador said, stopping at our table. His voice was quiet, but the room was quieter. I thought that was you. I didn't realize. He glanced at me, then at my parents. My father was standing now. Douglas, you know this man? The ambassador looked at my father, with an expression I recognized from certain patients, the look of someone deciding how honest to be. Know him? He said. Warren, this is Callum Reed. He chairs the Reed Land Conservancy, one of the largest private conservation trusts in the eastern region. $47 million in land preservation agreements. 8 rural counties. I've been trying to get him on the governor's environmental advisory panel for 2 years. He paused. He keeps declining. A beat. Because he says his work is on the ground, not in conference rooms. He looked at Callum with something close to affectionate exasperation. He's also, for what it's worth, the reason 3 rural physical therapy clinics in this state have operating funding right now. His conservancy's community health initiative. He glanced at me. I imagine you know more about that than I do. My father opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Callum addressed the room without raising his voice. I didn't come here tonight to make a point, he said. I came because Marin asked me to, and because she is the most quietly courageous person I know. She works 60-hour weeks helping people rebuild their lives after the worst things that can happen to a body. She does it without recognition and without complaint, and she has spent years in this family being treated like a footnote. He looked at my father. You had 18 months. You never asked my last name. That's a choice, and it tells me what you were measuring me against. He sat back down. Silence. Then I stood. My legs were not entirely steady, but my voice was. You've been saying it for 8 years, I said to my parents. Not always out loud, but in every seating arrangement. Every time you summarized my work in one word. Every time you introduced Brooke and then paused before mentioning me, like you were deciding whether to bother. My mother looked at her hands. I'm not here to perform anger. I'm just done. Done arranging myself to fit the space you've left for me. I looked at Callum. We're leaving. We walked out. 60 people watched. No one spoke. The call from Brooke came 3 days later. Her voice was stripped of its usual composure. Sebastian had told her he needed to postpone the wedding. He couldn't proceed with a ceremony that was still raw with what his father had witnessed. Ambassador Hargrove had quietly withdrawn from 2 professional associations my father sat on, citing, as Brooke relayed it, a difference in values that had become impossible to overlook. 2 of my father's long-standing clients had sent formal letters within the week. One cited concerns about professional judgment. The combined retainer loss was significant. My mother had received a politely worded message from the Women's Architecture Forum declining to include her on a panel she had been scheduled to moderate. I should have stood up for you before, Brooke said. I knew what they were doing and I didn't say anything because it was easier. I believed her mostly. What do you want from me, Brooke? I asked. I want you to let them apologize. I was quiet for a moment. Do they want to apologize or do they want the consequences to stop? She didn't answer and that was its own answer. My mother called 2 days later. Can you come to the house? Your father and I need to talk. I asked her the same question I'd asked Brooke. She was silent for longer than I expected. Then she said, I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But we've also been talking and I think I know we've failed you. Both things are true. That honesty cost her something. I heard it in her voice. I told her I would come and I told her what it would require, 8 weeks of family therapy, 1 session per week, beginning with a session in which I spoke without interruption about what the last 8 years had felt like. She agreed without negotiating. The session was hard. The ones after it were harder. Some weeks we made actual progress. Some weeks we just sat in the room together and endured it, which is maybe its own kind of progress. I don't know yet what will become. I've stopped needing to know. What I know is that I drove home from that first session and sat in my car for a few minutes before going inside, and the feeling in my chest was not relief, not vindication, just a specific unfamiliar lightness. Like a window had been opened in a room that had been closed for a long time. Callum was at his kitchen table when I arrived. He looked up from whatever he was reading, and I sat down across from him, and I said, "I think I'm okay." He nodded like that was the only answer he'd been waiting for. Brooke and Sebastian are taking the time they need. She told me last month she's been seeing her own therapist, working out, in her words, what she actually wants, separate from what our parents built their hopes around. I don't know what she'll find, but I think looking is the right direction. There's something clarifying about being seen clearly by someone who has nothing to gain from it. My family measured Callum against a scale of credentials and found him light. He was running one of the most meaningful conservation operations in the region and pouring money into rural healthcare, and none of it showed on the surface, because he never needed it to. He just did the work. I've thought about that a lot. About how much energy I spent, across all those years, trying to make my work legible to people who'd already decided what it was worth. So let me ask you something. Is there someone in your life whose value you've assessed entirely by what they've told you, or by what you assumed before you thought to ask? The morning I finally stopped carrying them, I made coffee first. That detail matters. I didn't lunge for my phone. I didn't rehearse the conversation I should have had years ago. I filled the kettle, set it on the burner, and stood in my narrow galley kitchen listening to the water begin its slow climb to boiling. Only when the cup was in my hands, still too hot to drink properly, did I open the laptop and pull up the file I'd named Insurance Docs, a name chosen precisely because no one in my family would ever click on it. The spreadsheet was 14 rows long. 4 years of monthly transfers, each one logged with a date, an amount, and a note field I'd filled in with the kind of neutral language an accountant would use. Household contribution. Recurring support. Living expense subsidy. I had refused, even in a private file no one would ever see, to call it what it was. I scrolled to the bottom. The sum cell read $223,200. I sat with that number for a long time. My name is Dana Whitfield. I'm a licensed healthcare compliance auditor, the kind of professional hospitals and medical groups hire when their billing practices are being reviewed by federal regulators. My work is by nature about finding what doesn't match. The procedure coded one way, billed another, the authorization that exists in one system and vanishes in the next. I am paid at a fairly good rate to notice discrepancies. I can spot a documentation gap from 50 feet. What I could not seem to do for 4 years running was apply that same clinical attention to my own life. My mother, Renata, had a gift for framing. She was the kind of woman who could say something cutting and have it land as a compliment before the sentence finished. My sister Brooke, 18 months younger, professionally a brand wellness strategist, which meant she consulted for boutique fitness companies on their Instagram aesthetic, was her masterwork. Brooke had vision, our mother said, often. Brooke understood people. Brooke had an instinct for beauty that couldn't be taught. I apparently was good with the details. The dinner at which all of this collapsed had begun the way those dinners usually did. My father, Warren, grilling salmon on the terrace of the downtown apartment, while Brooke narrated her latest project, and my mother nodded with an expression that implied she had personally brought Brooke's talent into the world and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. I had driven 40 minutes in traffic. I had brought wine. It was somewhere between the main course and what would never become dessert that my mother made her observation. Dana handles the practical side of things. Brooke is the one with the larger picture. She smiled when she said it. The smile was the part that got me. I set down my fork. The larger picture, I said, currently costs $4,600 a month. I would love for Brooke's vision to cover it. The table went quiet in a specific way, the way it goes quiet when someone has said a true thing in a room built entirely on the agreement not to. My father looked at me as if I'd switched languages mid-sentence. "Cover what?" he said. "We own this place." "No," I said. "You don't." I had looked into it 2 months earlier. The condo my parents had moved into after selling the suburban house was rented, not purchased. The proceeds of the sale had gone somewhere else, a fact my father genuinely did not know. He had trusted my mother with the financial transition completely. My mother had trusted Brooke's business venture, a wellness subscription box that had dissolved after 11 months, taking most of the capital with it. What remained was a rental that my father believed was an asset. What remained of his retirement was largely theoretical. I had known this for 8 weeks. I had kept making the transfers. I pushed back my chair. The sound of it across the hardwood was sharp and final, like a door with a good seal. I said goodbye. My mother started to speak. I was already walking. By the time I reached my car, my hands were steady. That was the thing I hadn't expected, not the steadiness itself, but how unsurprised I was by it. Somewhere in the 4 years of monthly transfers and dinners where I was described as reliable, predictable, the one who handled things, I had quietly made my decision. Tonight was just the moment I let it become audible. My phone started filling up before I'd cleared the parking structure. Brooke left 3 voice messages, each one in a higher register than the last. The framing shifted with each recording. First I was jealous, then I was cruel. Then I was destabilizing the family at a really vulnerable time. A phrase that might have landed differently if I hadn't spent the prior 2 years being the reason the family was not, technically, already destabilized. My mother's texts had the quality of someone who had convinced herself a clerical error was responsible. Transfer issue. Please call immediately. Dana, the bank flagged something. Call us. She could not write the actual words. She could not type you stopped. To her, that wasn't a possible sequence of events. The practical daughter paid the bills. That was the natural order. I didn't respond that night. I opened a different application and began drafting a formal non-renewal notice, the kind I had seen in a dozen compliance contexts, precise, statutory, stripped of anything that could be read as emotion. I cited the relevant notice period. I indicated the date by which the space would need to be vacated. I printed it, addressed it to my father, because my mother would have handed it to Brooke, and mailed it the next morning on my way to work. What came 10 days later was my father, standing in my office doorway with a manila folder he clearly believed contained evidence of something. He had found or been given a document he thought was a property deed. He put it on my desk. I looked at it for about 4 seconds. "This is a screenshot," I said. "The county recorder's watermark is a JPEG artifact. The parcel number doesn't match the building's address." I turned my monitor so he could see the actual registry search I'd already run. The transaction history on the sale proceeds was there, if you knew where to look, which he hadn't, and which I did. I watched his face work through several things at once. He had spent years believing the story his wife and younger daughter had been telling. He had believed it because it was easier, because it was the one on offer, because the alternative, that the money was gone, that his retirement had funded a subscription box for artisanal wellness products, was not a story a person volunteers to inhabit. "The $4,800 I've been paying every month," I said, and kept my voice level. "I thought I was protecting you. I was actually just delaying it." He didn't answer. We sat in the silence of that for a moment. 60 days later, I stood in the apartment one final time for the walkthrough. Brooke cycled through several modes: apology, grievance, appeal, with the efficiency of someone who had learned early that emotion was a tool. My mother stood very still, which was how she looked when she had decided the appropriate response was to wait for circumstances to correct themselves. My father looked out the window at the city he had wanted to live in, and had not, it turned out, been able to afford. I left the keys on the kitchen counter. I said goodbye clearly and I closed the door. 3 weeks later, I signed a lease on a 1-bedroom unit in a building I had selected myself, evaluated the financials on, and could afford without restructuring anything else in my life. It was on the 4th floor. In the mornings, the light came in at an angle that made the whole room feel different from the studios and sublets I'd been rotating through for 4 years while paying for someone else's view. I sat at the kitchen table that first morning with coffee and my laptop, the insurance docs folder open and renamed at last. I had retitled it Baseline, not as a sentiment, as an accounting term, the point from which forward movement is measured. Here is what I understand now. On the other side of it, there is a particular kind of invisible labor that looks from the outside like reliability. The person doing it often believes they are holding something fragile together. Sometimes what they are actually doing is holding something false in place, keeping the pressure low enough that no one has to look at the structure underneath. It is not love, though it can feel like it. It is maintenance of a fiction, usually at significant personal cost. If someone in your life has named you the capable one, the practical one, the one who handles things, it may be worth asking what exactly it is you are handling, and whether the building you are supporting was ever really meant to stand. I walked into the hearing room on a Tuesday morning in November carrying nothing but a manila folder, and whatever composure I had left after 5 years of deliberate silence. The fluorescent lights in the Caldwell County Administrative Building hummed at a frequency that seemed designed to irritate. I set my folder on the respondent's table, smoothed the front of my jacket, and sat down. At the table across the room, my parents sat beside their attorney, a compact, self-assured man named Gerald Fitch who had the look of someone accustomed to winning arguments before they started. My mother didn't look at me. My father looked at me the way you look at a stranger who is sitting in your usual seat at a restaurant. I had not spoken to either of them in close to 5 years. The last real conversation ended with my father saying I had wasted every opportunity they had given me, and my mother nodding along like she was co-signing a loan. I packed 2 duffel bags that night and drove south before dawn. No dramatic goodbye. No forwarding address. Just the particular peace that comes when you finally stop waiting for people to understand you. I had not planned to return to Caldwell County at all. Then my grandmother died. Her name was Loretta. She was my father's mother, a small, deliberate woman who had spent 78 years in the same county and had somehow managed in all that time to be honest without being cruel. She used to say that most people confuse loudness with strength. She was never loud. She called me every few weeks during the years I was away. She never asked me to come home. She only ever asked whether I was taking care of myself. The call came from her physician, a Dr. Haynes, who had been treating her for the past 2 years. He told me she had passed quietly, and that her attorney had reached out because her will contained specific instructions for me. I sat in my apartment in Raleigh for a long time after that call, staring at the wall above my desk. The space in my chest that opened up when he said her name felt less like grief and more like a floor giving way. Her will left me the house she owned on Sutter Road, a modest 2-story with a vegetable garden along the south fence and a screened porch where she kept her reading chair. It was not a large property. It was not worth what my parents thought it was worth. But it was the only place in Caldwell County where I had ever felt like myself, and I suspect Loretta knew that. My parents found out within 48 hours. My father called from a number I recognized and left a voicemail that lasted 4 minutes. The essential message was that the house should come to them, that I had no right to property in a family I had abandoned, and that Loretta must have been confused in her final months. I did not call back. 3 weeks later, I was served with a formal dispute filing at my apartment door. I drove to Caldwell County on a gray Sunday and let myself into Loretta's house with the key she had mailed me 2 years earlier, tucked inside a birthday card with no explanation. The house smelled like cedar and old paper. Her reading glasses were still on the table beside the porch chair. I sat down in that chair, looked out at the dormant garden, and spent a long time thinking about what I was walking into. The first time I saw Gerald Fitch in person was 2 days before the hearing when he approached me outside the county records office. He was polite in the calibrated way attorneys are polite when they want to appear reasonable before making an unreasonable request. He told me my parents were under considerable financial pressure. He told me that Loretta's house represented meaningful stability for them at this stage of life. Then he told me that if I signed the property over voluntarily, we could avoid an unpleasant public proceeding. I told him I would see him at the hearing. He smiled with his mouth only. The hearing room held perhaps 30 people, most of them Caldwell County residents with no legal stake in the matter. Small county proceedings have always drawn a crowd. The adjudicator was a woman named Patricia Voss, 50s, silver-streaked hair pulled back, the expression of someone who had presided over too many family disputes to be surprised by any of them. Fitch went first. He built his argument carefully, the way a person builds something they expect to last. My parents had maintained close ties with Loretta. They had assisted with her medical appointments, her grocery runs, her home repairs. I, by contrast, had been absent for years. I had not attended family holidays. I had not visited during Loretta's illness. The picture he painted was of a woman who returned only when there was something to collect. Then my mother asked to speak. She stood with the practiced posture of someone who had rehearsed. She told adjudicator Voss about the years of worry, the holidays with an empty chair, the phone calls that went unreturned. She was not wrong about any of it. But then her voice shifted into something harder, something she had been carrying for a long time, and had finally found a room large enough to release it into. She looked at me directly and said that I had always been the selfish one. That I had taken from this family my whole life and given nothing back. That I was, in the end, simply a disappointment she had stopped expecting anything from. The room went quiet in that specific way it does when someone has said something that cannot be unsaid. Adjudicator Voss did not react immediately. She made a note. Then she looked at my folder on the table in front of me. Before she could speak, Fitch moved to continue his argument. Voss raised one hand slightly and stopped him. She looked at the folder again, then at me with the measuring expression of someone recalibrating. She said quietly, "Miss Hale, perhaps you'd like to submit your documentation." I brought my folder to the clerk. Inside were the letters I had written to Loretta over 5 years, most of them returned with her handwriting in the margins. There were records of the money transfers I had sent her quarterly. Nothing large but consistent, enough to cover the property tax 2 years running when she mentioned it casually in a phone call. There was also a letter from my former employer, the United States Department of Veterans Affairs, where I had worked for 6 years as a regional compliance analyst overseeing audit documentation for 3 states. Fitch looked at the letterhead for a long moment. Voss read through the documents with the focused quiet of someone who reads carefully for a living. She paused at the VA letter. She set it down. She looked at Fitch. "Counselor," she said. "Are you familiar with your opposing party's professional background?" Fitch said he understood her to be a private citizen with no particular standing. "She spent 6 years conducting federal compliance audits," Voss said. "She has documented every financial contribution she made to this estate. She has corresponding written records from the decedent, acknowledging receipt." She set her pen down. "The picture you presented this morning appears to be missing several relevant details." My father leaned forward. My mother turned to look at me as though she were seeing a different person sitting at the table. Fitch recovered as well as he could. He argued that professional credentials did not determine inheritance rights. Voss agreed with him. She also noted, without particular emphasis, that they did tend to complicate arguments about a person's character and intentions. She said it the way someone says a true thing that doesn't require elaboration. My mother said sharply that she hadn't known any of this. That I had never told them. I looked at her steadily. "You never asked," I said. Voss upheld the will. The house on Sutter Road remained mine. When the room cleared, my parents stayed seated. Their attorney left quickly. I gathered my folder and stood, and for a moment, the 3 of us occupied that room without the structure of legal proceedings to organize the silence. My father spoke first. His voice had lost its courtroom certainty. He asked what I had actually been doing, all those years. I told him. Not everything, but enough. The compliance work, the travel, the slow accumulation of a life that had nothing to do with Caldwell County. He listened in the way people listen when they are revising something they thought they already understood. My mother said she had assumed the worst because I had given her no information, and I told her as gently as I could that I had stopped offering information because it was never received the way I intended it. That the conversation always became an argument. That eventually I chose silence over repetition. She didn't respond immediately. Then she said that calling me a disappointment had been wrong. She said it plainly without performance. My father nodded beside her. I did not tell them it was fine. It wasn't fine. But I told them it was noted, and that I was going to fix up the house, and that if they wanted to see what Loretta had left behind, they were welcome to come by. The following weekend, my father arrived with a toolbox. We repaired the south fence without speaking much. The silence was different from the silence in the hearing room. It was the kind that comes before something rather than after. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that settles over you when a conflict you have been carrying for years finally reaches its conclusion. It doesn't feel like winning. It feels like setting down something heavy and noticing for the first time how much your arms ache. Loretta used to say that families are not made from biology alone. They are made from the slow work of showing up, even when showing up is inconvenient. I don't know yet whether my parents and I will manage that work. But I know that for the first time in years, the door is no longer locked from either side. If there is someone in your life you have been certain you understood completely, a child, a parent, a sibling you haven't spoken to in years, I want to ask you something. When did you last ask them a question you didn't already have an answer for? The morning Delia's sister walked into her bakery and called sugarwork a hobby for people afraid of real ambition. Delia had smiled, wiped her hands on her apron, and said nothing. She had learned early that some silences cost less than some words. But she remembered it. She remembered everything. Her name is Delia, and she lives in Raleigh, North Carolina, where the summers arrive without asking and stay longer than welcome. She had built her life slowly, the way a good dough develops, with patience, pressure, and time. Her bakery, a narrow two-room space on the east side of town with a hand-painted sign and windows that fogged on cold mornings, had taken 4 years to stop losing money and another 2 to start making real money. She was proud of it the way you are proud of something that nearly broke you before it didn't. Her husband, Marcus, was a craftsman in the oldest sense, a man who worked with metal, fabricating custom ironwork for residential and commercial clients. Gates. Railings. Structural brackets that architects called beautiful because they were also precise. He had apprenticed under an old metalworker named Garrett, a broad-shouldered man with a workshop full of tools and a reputation that preceded him across 3 counties. Marcus had expanded on everything Garrett taught him, adding a quiet perfectionism that made his clients return and refer. In their neighborhood, people recognized his name before his face. He had a way of solving problems with his hands that made engineers feel slightly embarrassed. Delia had met Marcus on a ridiculous afternoon in a hardware store parking lot when a shelf she had badly overloaded collapsed and scattered $200 of baking supplies across hot asphalt. He was loading copper tubing into a truck nearby. He didn't laugh, or rather he laughed only briefly before crouching down to help her collect everything, and then he helped her rig the shelf properly before she even asked. She married him 3 years later, and considered the collapsed shelf one of the better things she had ever built poorly. Her older sister Renata was the kind of woman who entered rooms like she expected applause. A corporate attorney at a firm with a downtown address and a lobby that smelled like ambition, she had spent most of her adult life performing a version of success, so polished it had become her personality. Her husband Conrad was a cardiovascular surgeon, handsome, charming at dinner parties, less present everywhere else. They drove a car that cost more than Delia's first lease agreement and spoke about their social calendar the way other people speak about oxygen. Growing up, Renata had been the acknowledged star. Perfect grades, debate trophies. The daughter their parents bragged about at every gathering. Delia had been quieter, more interested in the slow chemistry of fermentation than in performance. She had not minded the shadow, mostly. But she had noticed, more as an adult than as a child, that Renata needed the shadow to exist, needed someone standing in it. The bakery's contract with the Magnolia House, a boutique event venue that hosted weddings and private dinners across the Research Triangle, had been Delia's largest account. Custom wedding cakes, dessert tables, small batch pastries for their weekend events. It represented nearly a third of her annual revenue, and more importantly, it had given her credibility. Venue clients came with budgets and networks. One good referral from Magnolia House was worth a dozen cold inquiries. Renata had come into the bakery unannounced on a Tuesday, clicking across the tile floor in heels that were entirely inappropriate for a space where flour lived on every surface. She had looked around with an expression that tried to seem impressed but landed somewhere closer to tolerant. "Still doing the cake thing," she said. It was not a question. "I just renewed with Magnolia House," Delia told her. Their full spring season. Something moved across Renata's face, there and gone, a fish below the surface. "Right," she said. Conrad and I were just talking about presentation standards. Corporate event catering is a different world. Not everyone can make that transition. She touched an edge of a sample album with 2 fingers like she was handling evidence, and left 20 minutes later with nothing purchased and several things implied. 2 weeks after that visit, Delia received a call from the venue coordinator at Magnolia House. Apologetic, brief, carefully worded. They were reconsidering their vendor arrangement for the season. No specific reason given. Delia had learned in 4 years of running a small business that no specific reason always meant a specific reason that someone didn't want to say out loud. She called Petra, her contact at the venue, a woman Delia had worked beside at 2 charity events and trusted accordingly. Petra's voice was careful on the phone. Someone had called the venue's director of events. Said there had been complaints about consistency. Said the account had become a liability because of the family connection. She had also forwarded photographs, blurry and poorly lit, claiming they documented recent work. They were not your work, Petra said quietly. I knew immediately. The replacement the caller had suggested was a new vendor, a woman named Gwen who had recently started a dessert business out of her home kitchen, trying to build something for herself and her daughter after a difficult few years. Delia sat in the back of her bakery that evening after closing, not crying because she was too controlled for crying in the moment and too angry. The anger was the cold kind, which is worse. Marcus found her there when he came home, still carrying the smell of metal and heat treatment. He sat beside her and listened completely. Then he called Garrett. Garrett's name, it turned out, opened doors at Magnolia House that Delia hadn't known existed. He had fabricated the venue's original staircase railings and maintained a friendship with their general manager. By the following week, Delia's contract was not only restored but expanded. Magnolia House added their fall season to the agreement and asked whether she could accommodate a corporate client they were hoping to bring on. Petra made calls of her own within the event planning network. Renata's complaints were not, it emerged, received well by people who had actually seen Delia's work. The industry was smaller than it appeared. Gwen came to the bakery on a Saturday morning, clearly uncomfortable, with a printed thread of messages on her phone. She explained what had happened, what she had been told, how she had been positioned. She hadn't understood until Petra explained what her involvement had actually meant. She was apologetic in the way people are when they realize they've been used as a tool, and feel genuinely ashamed of it. Delia made her coffee and told her about a bridal expo the following month with vendor slots still available. 3 weeks after that, the family's annual summer cookout arrived, a tradition at their uncle's property outside of Raleigh, with a long table under old oak trees and a grill that ran from noon to dark. When Renata and Conrad arrived, they announced themselves in the way they always did, by way of what they had recently acquired. A trip planned, a conference Conrad had been invited to, a new vehicle in the driveway that Renata mentioned twice without being asked. Their cousin, attempting to redirect toward easier territory, asked Marcus about a recent project. Before Marcus could answer, Renata cut through the question like it was irrelevant. You're still doing the ironwork, she said. Not unkindly. Precisely unkindly. Conrad knows people in hospital administration. There might be something more structured available, if you ever wanted a change. The table stilled. Marcus set down his fork with the care of a man who has decided what he is and isn't going to do. I appreciate that, he said evenly. But I built a bracket last week that solved a load-bearing problem 3 engineers missed. I find the work pretty satisfying. Garrett, seated nearby, mentioned without fanfare that Marcus had just been contacted by a regional hospital network about maintaining their facility infrastructure. Conrad glanced at his phone. Renata said something about how quaint that was. Conrad had gone quiet. Later, while people moved toward dessert, Renata announced they had to leave early. Surgery in the morning. Responsibilities. She said it the way people do when they mean, we matter more than this. The SUV started, moved 3 feet and produced a sound like something giving up. It lurched forward once, then stopped. Conrad got out, looked underneath and said nothing useful. Marcus offered to have someone from Garrett's shop assess it in the morning. Renata, standing in the driveway with her composure losing cohesion, said they would wait for a certified technician. Marcus is certified, Garrett said from the porch, with the evenness of someone who doesn't need to perform authority. High-end vehicle systems. One of 4 people in the state with that particular qualification. They waited for a different option. No different option came. The car was towed to Garrett's shop the next morning. When Renata arrived at the workshop, she moved through it the way people do when they are trying to maintain a position they no longer hold. She questioned whether the cost estimate was accurate. She questioned whether Marcus had the right equipment. Conrad stood to one side, quieter than Delia had ever seen him. And when Marcus emerged with a tablet showing the transmission failure and the brake wear, Conrad handed over his card before Renata finished her sentence. It was in the workshop, in the flat light of a weekday morning, that the other thing came out. The Chicago conference. The one Conrad had mentioned at the cookout and then deflected from. Not a conference. A job interview. The promotion he'd told Renata he'd received hadn't come. The house they were in, the car they drove, the life Renata had been presenting to every room she entered, it was financed on a projection that hadn't held. Delia was not there when it happened. Gwen was waiting on a tire rotation, and she told her about it later with no relish, just the plainness of someone reporting what occurred. Renata came to Delia's house 2 weeks later. No heels. A plain jacket. She sat on the couch like a person who had recently had to relearn how chairs work. She said that Delia must be pleased. She said that Conrad had suggested they list the house. She said the women in her social circle weren't returning messages. That's not something I arranged, Delia told her. She kept her voice level. Renata looked at her wedding ring for a moment. She mentioned that Conrad had shown her the invoice from Garrett's shop, significantly below what a dealership would have charged. She said Marcus had done good work. It sounded like something that cost her. Then she straightened. The hospital gala needs a dessert vendor. I told them I might know someone. My calendar's full through the fall, Delia said. But Gwen has availability. She does excellent work. Renata left in a modest sedan. Delia stood at her window and watched the car until it turned the corner. That evening, Marcus came home with news about a facilities maintenance contract. Garrett was bringing him on to run it, and they were hiring. Petra came over. Gwen stopped by. They ate in the backyard as the Raleigh sky went to orange and then to dark, and someone mentioned that Conrad had apparently taken the Chicago position. Renata was deciding whether to follow. She built a cage, Gwen said, and kept decorating it. Marcus took Delia's hand. The city glowed faintly over the rooftops. They had work they believed in, friends who had shown up, and a life that didn't require an audience. Looking back, what strikes me most is not what Renata did, but what it revealed, that cruelty dressed as concern is still cruelty, and that the people who most need to diminish you are rarely as secure as they appear. The tools we use to undermine others have a way of circling back. So let me ask you this. If the person most committed to shrinking your life suddenly needed yours to keep theirs intact, what would you do, and what would that answer tell you about yourself? I arrived before the caterers, before the cousins, before anyone who would later act as though the party had simply materialized on its own. That was the arrangement, unspoken but consistent across every Thanksgiving, every 4th of July, every occasion my father's new household needed to look like a family that had it together. I would show up, unlock the side entrance, and begin the invisible work of turning an empty backyard into something that photographed well. That Easter was no different, except that it was the last one. The yard still held the night's rain when I arrived. Folding tables were stacked against the back fence where my stepmother Cora had left them sometime in the previous week. I hauled them out 2 at a time, set up the chairs, spread the rented linens I'd ordered and paid for 10 days earlier. The plastic eggs were in a cardboard box in the storage room, along with the extension cords, the portable speaker, and 2 coolers that still faintly remembered last summer's beer. I arranged the egg hunt trail myself, tucking eggs behind the raised garden beds, under the hydrangeas, around the base of the old sycamore in the corner. By 9 in the morning, the yard looked like a celebration. The trick to that kind of work is that the better you do it, the less anyone notices it was done at all. My name is Marlowe, and for roughly 11 years I had been the operational backbone of my father's holiday calendar. not because anyone asked me outright. It had accreted gradually, the way responsibilities do when you're competent and present and slightly too unwilling to say no. I'd grown up in that house, and when my father married Cora, I'd told myself that staying useful was a reasonable way to stay connected. I'm a project coordinator for a mid-sized event logistics company, which means I know how to manage vendors, confirm timelines, and hold a budget together under pressure. Skills the family benefited from regularly, though no one would have described it that way. They would have said I was helpful. They would have said I loved doing it. The catering confirmation came through on my phone at 9:47. I'd contracted through a local kitchen that Cora had mentioned once in passing, liked the sound of, and then never followed up on. I'd called them, arranged the menu, submitted the deposit, and confirmed the final headcount the previous Tuesday. 43 people. A full afternoon spread. The balance had cleared my account the Thursday before. By mid-morning, the yard was filling. My brother Theo arrived with his 2 kids, who immediately demanded to know when the egg hunt was starting. Cousins I hadn't seen since the previous November drifted in with wine bottles and questions directed exclusively at me. Where do the desserts go? Is there parking on the side street? Do you need help with anything? I told them where things went. I answered the parking question. I said I was fine. Cora walked through the yard once around 11, nodding at the tables, the linens, the arrangement of chairs. She had the expression of someone reviewing work they'd commissioned. My father spent the morning near the fire pit with 2 neighbors from the cul-de-sac, talking about something that required a lot of arm gesturing. He didn't ask when I'd arrived. No one did. The egg hunt ran at 1 o'clock and went exactly as those things do, loud, briefly chaotic, over in 12 minutes. Kids ran across the still damp grass, while adults stood at the perimeter with drinks, laughing at nothing in particular. One of my cousins told me I'd outdone myself this year. I thanked her and meant none of it. Not because I was ungrateful, but because the compliment arrived at the wrong address. It was the kind of praise that confirms you're useful without suggesting you're welcome. The catering van arrived at 3:30. I met the crew at the side gate, walked them through the kitchen layout, showed them the outlet situation, confirmed the service timeline. The lead, a man named Derek, recognized me from the Thanksgiving booking. Same contact as before, he asked. Same contact, I said. Everything's already settled on the account. He nodded and started directing his team. The afternoon reached that specific quality that good outdoor gatherings sometimes achieve. The sense that everything is running exactly as it should, and no one needs to do anything but enjoy it. The yard was full. Conversations overlapped pleasantly. Kids who'd been frantic 2 hours earlier were now calm and sugar calm near the dessert table. The catering trays were warming in the kitchen, the smell of the food drifting out through the screen door. My father was at the head of the long table when he said it. He wasn't shouting. He used the particular register he reserved for corrections made in company, loud enough to carry, quiet enough to seem casual. He looked at me and said that I had to understand I was a guest in his home now, not a member of the household, and that guests didn't run things. Cora sat beside him, her expression composed and confirming. Theo stared at his plate with the focused attention of someone who had found something extremely important in the pattern of the ceramic. The yard went quieter than yards usually go. I stood up from my chair without rushing. A few people assumed I was going inside to bring something out. Someone near the end of the table asked if dinner was starting. I didn't answer either question. The kitchen was cool and organized. Derek's crew was doing final prep, lifting the foil covers to check temperatures. I picked up my bag from the counter where I'd left it that morning. Pulled out my phone. The catering account was still open on the screen. Derek came in a minute later. Ready to begin service? I need to cancel it, I said. He looked at me. I'm the account holder. I need to stop the service and return the order. There is a specific quality to bureaucratic authority that has nothing to do with volume or emotion. It is simply a matter of whose name is on the invoice. Mine was on every document, every confirmation email, the deposit receipt, and the final payment. I called the company's main line, the same number I'd used to place the original order, and submitted a cancellation request in the same tone I use on any vendor call. Steady. Factual. Procedural. When I hung up, Derek nodded once. Understood. We'll repack. The confusion outside started gradually, the way it always does when the architecture of an event begins to come apart without announcement. People noticed the catering staff moving equipment. Trays being covered and lifted back toward the van. The buffet line that had been forming naturally along the fence wasn't forming anymore. I was in the front hallway when my father came inside. "What's happening with the food?" "It's leaving," I said. He looked at me for a long moment. "What do you mean it's leaving?" "I thought this was arranged." "It was arranged under my account." He processed that. The mechanics of it were simple, but the implications took a few seconds. "You can't just walk out of here," he said. I adjusted the strap on my bag. I thought I was a guest. I didn't deliver the line for effect. It was simply the most accurate sentence available. Behind him, Derek appeared in the hallway entrance and explained quietly that since the account holder had requested cancellation, he said it the way people in service industries explain policy to upset customers, clear, impersonal. My father had no procedural counter to that. There wasn't one. Theo was standing in the hallway. He had followed my father inside and was watching from near the stairs. For the first time since he'd arrived that morning, he was looking directly at me rather than at a middle distance. I nodded at him once. Then I walked out the front door. From the driveway, I could hear the yard changing behind me. Voices rising with questions. Chairs scraping back. Children asking why the food was going in the wrong direction. The gathering was unraveling in the specific way that gatherings do when the organizational layer beneath them is removed all at once. Driving away felt less like a decision, and more like the conclusion of a very long equation. For years I'd operated on the assumption that usefulness was a currency that purchased something. Belonging, maybe. Or at least the right to occupy a room without being reminded that the room wasn't mine. What I understood now on the interstate heading south was that I'd confused two things that were never the same. 40 minutes later, my phone showed a message from Theo. He said he hadn't understood how much I'd been carrying. I read it twice. I set the phone down without answering. I stopped at a diner near the county line, the kind with vinyl booths and fluorescent lighting that flatters no one. I ordered coffee and a slice of coconut cream pie and sat in the window booth while the sky went from pink to dark outside. Somewhere back across town, a family gathering was concluding without its infrastructure. Someone would figure out dinner. Or they wouldn't. For the first time in 11 years, neither outcome required anything from me. That feeling didn't have a clean name. It wasn't relief exactly, and it wasn't grief. It was something that felt like arriving at the correct answer to a problem you've been solving for a decade. Some people spend years making themselves indispensable to spaces that have quietly decided they are optional. The labor gets normalized. The resentment gets buried. And eventually you're setting up folding tables in a wet backyard at 8 in the morning for people who will spend the afternoon reminding you of your place. Have you ever looked around at something you built and asked yourself honestly whether the people inside it have ever actually asked you to stay?